Picture the air before the first drop hits. Heavy, sour, the kind of silence that feels like the world is holding its breath. Then it happens. The sky doesn't just rain. It tears. Genesis says, "The windows of the heavens were opened, and beneath your feet, the fountains of the great deep burst forth." Water from above, water from below, like the whole world is splitting at the seams. You look for something solid, anything ordered, anything safe, but the lines are dissolving. Roads vanish, fields disappear, the familiar becomes a single restless surface. And out there, floating on that swelling chaos, is the ark. Not a ship gliding where it wants. A massive wooden box, a man-made island of breathing life. Pairs of animals, food stored in order, a family huddled together while everything else is being swallowed. It's terrifying, not only because of the water, because somewhere inside you is the moral question you've always tried to keep quiet. What kind of God unravels the world like this? Is this just divine anger, temper, impulse, cosmic overreaction? But Genesis keeps whispering that something else is happening. Something more deliberate, as if creation itself is being pulled backward. And the reason isn't random wrath. It's tied to a world saturated with violence, and to a promise line God refuses to let drown. Here's what everyone gets wrong about the flood. Most people read it as a simple punishment story. Humans are bad, God is mad, so God wipes them out. But what the Bible actually teaches hidden in plain sight is that Genesis frames the flood as a judicial response to a world that has been unmade by human violence. And then, just as intentionally, God begins to remake it, preserving a specific line so his purpose for blessing doesn't die. Genesis doesn't lead with the word angry. It leads with diagnosis. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Genesis chapter 6 verse 11. The Hebrew word for violence there is hamas, not just personal wrongdoing, but social brutality. The kind of evil that spreads. The kind that fills the land. And then comes God's verdict. "I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them." Genesis chapter 6 verse 13. Notice the logic. The earth is ruined. It's not functioning as creation anymore. It's become the opposite of what God spoke into being in Genesis chapter 1. So the flood is not pictured as God losing control. It's God refusing to normalize anti-creation. And the story is built to make you see it. The waters return. Boundaries collapse. Breath leaves living things. It's creation running in reverse to creation. But right in the middle of that reversal, God does something else. He speaks about preserving. "I will establish my covenant with you." Genesis chapter 6 verse 18. Not because humans deserve a restart, but because God is committed to his design for the world. That ark you pictured? It's not just a rescue boat. It's the seed of recreation. And to understand how Genesis signals all of this, you have to watch the text carefully, word by word, echo by echo. The story slows down before the rain so you can feel what kind of world is being judged. Genesis chapter 6 doesn't describe a few isolated sins. It describes a planet-wide condition. "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and even more haunting. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Genesis chapter 6 verse 5. That's not a momentary relapse. That's a settled direction. Then the narrator gives you the headline twice, like a drumbeat: corrupt, and filled with violence. The earth isn't just morally stained, it's saturated. And that's why the flood is framed as cosmic. The text isn't trying to show God reacting to petty rule-breaking. It's showing humanity dismantling the world's ability to be a home for life. The Hebrew word for corrupt is *shahad*, to ruin, to spoil, to wreck. It's used again when God says, "I will destroy them with the earth." Genesis chapter 6 verse 13. In other words, what humans have done to creation, God will now do in judgment. The same verb. That mirroring is intentional. Sin is pictured as decreation, and judgment matches the crime. And yes, the ancient world had flood stories. People across the ancient Near East told tales about primeval waters and catastrophic deluges. But Genesis is doing something distinct with the theme. It refuses to make the flood about divine moodiness or irritation. It anchors the catastrophe in moral cause, violence. It even shows the Creator's grief. God is portrayed as pained over what his world has become. Genesis chapter 6 verse 6, not amused, not indifferent. That means you're not reading an ancient disaster myth. You're reading a theological diagnosis. When violence becomes the atmosphere, creation itself starts to unravel. The flood is God's refusal to let that unraveling go on forever. But if that's the world outside the ark, the real shock is how the story tells it through echoes of Genesis chapter 1, as if the author wants you to hear creation being undone in the very sound of the words. Once you hear those echoes, the flood narrative starts to read like Genesis chapter 1 played backward. In the beginning, God brings order by separating waters above from waters below, seas from dry land. In the flood, those separations collapse. Genesis chapter 7 doesn't just say, "It rained." It says, "The fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened." Below and above, deep and sky, the boundaries that made habitable space are being reversed. And the language keeps pressing it. The waters prevailed. Again and again, the dry land that emerged on day 3 disappears under an unbroken surface. Then comes the undoing of life itself. All flesh perishes, and everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. Genesis chapter 7 verse 22. That phrase, breath of life, is the same concept you remember from Genesis chapter 2, God's life-giving breath now absent from the creatures that depended on it. Even the verb choices matter. Genesis says God will blot out life. Genesis chapter 6 verse 7. It's the idea of wiping something away, like erasing writing from a tablet. Not a tantrum, a deliberate removal of what has become corrupted. But then quietly the text pivots. God remembered Noah, Genesis chapter 8 verse 1. That doesn't mean God had forgotten and suddenly recalled. In Scripture, remember is covenant language. It means God turns toward someone to act faithfully. And what does he do? God made a wind blow over the earth. The Hebrew word is ruah wind, breath, spirit. It's the same word hovering over the waters in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. Over the deep again. Now the waters begin to recede. Land reappears. A dove goes out and comes back with an olive leaf, signs of a world becoming habitable again. And when Noah steps onto dry ground, God speaks blessing words that sound familiar: fruitfulness, multiplication, life continuing. So the flood story is structured as decreation followed by recreation. Which means the ark isn't just survival. It's a moving boundary line between chaos and order, and intentional preservation of life so God can start again without abandoning the world. And that raises the next question the text itself forces on you. Preserved for what? Why save this family in particular? Why attach the restart of creation to a covenant promise line? You can now see the flood as decreation and recreation. But Genesis is even more specific. God isn't only restarting the world, he's guarding a covenant thread, and the sign comes from an unexpected place. And here's where the flood stops being only about water and starts being about words. Right before the deluge, God says something astonishingly targeted. "I will establish my covenant with you," Genesis chapter 6 verse 18. Not with humanity in general. With Noah, the decreation is global, but the preservation is narrowed down. Like God is protecting one living strand inside the unraveling. That strand matters because Genesis has been tracing a line since Eden. Even after rebellion, God speaks of offspring. Then comes a genealogy that keeps asking, quietly, will blessing survive? By the time you reach Noah, the question has turned urgent. If the earth is filled with hamas violence, then the promise can't simply continue. It has to be carried. And notice the shape of the covenant. God doesn't say, if you do this, then I'll do that. The language is divine initiative. I will establish. God binds himself to a future, even while judging the present. After the waters recede, the covenant expands outward in Genesis chapter 9. God speaks not only to Noah, but to you and to your offspring after you, and with every living creature, Genesis chapter 9 verses 9 to 10. That's massive. The reboot of creation is tied to a public guarantee that the stage of history will remain standing. Then comes the sign, the bow in the clouds. In Hebrew it's kesed *, a bow, like a weapon. And where is it placed? Not in Noah's hand, not in humanity's hand, in the heavens, pointed away from the earth, like a warrior hanging up the instrument of judgment. The message is not that human violence has been solved. Genesis will show you it hasn't. The message is that God is restraining total collapse so his long purpose can keep moving. That's why the post-flood blessing echoes creation. Be fruitful and multiply. Genesis chapter 9 verse 1. Same mandate, same world, remade, but now framed by covenant by God's commitment to preserve life even in a still fallen human story. So the flood is judgment, yes. But it's also protection. The chaos is not allowed to drown the promised line. And once you see that, a harder question rises. If God restrains the waters, what does he say about the violence that summoned them in the first place, and what does that reveal about how God treats his world now? The flood is terrifying for the reason Genesis insists on, because sin is not small. It doesn't stay tucked inside a soul as a private flaw. It spreads. It fills. It becomes hamas a world where the strong devour the weak and the earth itself becomes ruined. And when that happens, God's judgment is not a mood swing. It's the Creator refusing to call anti-creation normal. But the same story that shows you waters swallowing mountains also shows you a covenant holding history together. A wooden ark, packed with breath and order, riding the chaos. A**Rua** wind, breath moving again over the deep. Dry land returning, blessing re-spoken, and a bow hung in the clouds like a vow. The world will remain a world. Time will keep turning. The promised line will not be drowned. That is the thread to carry out of Genesis chapters 6 to 9. God's holiness means violence cannot be shrugged off. God's mercy means creation will not be discarded. And when Scripture later speaks of a final rescue and a final cleansing, it's building on this same grammar. God confronts what destroys life, and God preserves life to the end. If this lens opened the flood narrative for you to creation, recreation, and a covenant that keeps the future possible, there's more hidden in plain sight like this all through Scripture. Stay with the channel by subscribing, and keep going deeper into the Bible's patterns, starting with what the covenant with Noah sets in motion for everything that comes after.